Hello, my fifth graders. Welcome to 6.5. So 6.5's lesson is common denominators and equivalent fractions. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to look at 3 different ways to find a common denominator. And you're just going to end up choosing the way that works best for you. And then how to use that common denominator to make an equivalent fraction. So exciting. All right, let's start. 6.5 common denominators and equivalent fractions. All right, so here's what we're working with. There are 3 ways to create a common denominator, to get a common denominator. You really want to be using the least common denominator, and that will make it so that once you start adding and subtracting these fractions, you don't need to simplify as much. However, sometimes finding that least common denominator is the tricky part. And so what I always would tell my students, and what I'm going to tell you, same thing, either you become really good at finding that common denominator or you become really good at simplifying. But you are going to need to have one of those. So common denominator, equivalent fractions. The 2 fractions we're going to be working with this time is 5/8 and 7/20. So my denominator is 8 and 20, and I need to find a common denominator. The first way is just multiply. Multiply them. It will get you a common denominator. Every single time you're going to get a common denominator. Is it going to be the least common denominator? Not usually. Most of the time, no. It's not going to be your least common denominator. It's going to be kind of big and kind of hard to work with. However, it will get you a common denominator. So first thing you can do is just straight up multiply them. And in this case, I had 8 times 20, which is 160. So now I'm dealing with a denominator of 160. Easy peasy. It's not. Nothing about fractions is easy. Except multiplying and dividing. Oh, that does get easier. So I have 160. That's going to be my new common denominator. I can make both of these numbers become 160. How did 8 become 160? Well, I already know I multiplied by 20. That's another thing that's easy about this, is I know how it got there. So 8 times 20 is 160. 5 times 20 is 100. Great. So 100 over 160. 20 times 8 is 160. So 7 times 8 is 56. And I'm done. Whatever you do to the bottom, you must do to the top. Whatever you do to the bottom, you must do the top. It's the same thing with division, right? Whatever I did to that divisor, I must do the dividend, because division is a type of fraction. Are fractions a type of division? So that's our first step. Multiply them. Done. That will get you an answer, but you got to be really good at simplifying, because whatever happens here, there's going to be some simplifying. So step 2, or way number 2. List the multiples. Find the least common. Now, many times students that I've had in the past are able to kind of do this mentally. Some students aren't. I was never the student that could do things mentally. So list the multiples, find the least common multiple. We often call this the LCM, the least common multiple. All right, so what does that look like? I have 8 and I have 20. I always list the larger number first. I always start with the larger number because theoretically I'm going to need fewer of the larger ones than I am going to the smaller ones because I take bigger jumps, right? So 20, 40 times 3 times 4, and I'll stop there. Now 8. I'm going to keep going until I get one of these numbers. Hopefully you see what it is already. 8 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. Ah, we have a winner, you guys. I've got 40. 40 is my least common multiple. So I'm going to take my two fractions, 5/8 and 7/20. 5/8, 7/20. And I'm going to make them become 40ths. Now, how did I go from 8 to 40? I multiplied by 5. Whatever I do to the bottom, I must do the top. 5 times 5 is 25. Now, how did I go from 20 to 40? I multiplied by 2. Whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. 7 times 2 is 14. There you go. I have used my least common multiple to make equivalent fractions. And I did that by listing the multiples. So the first way I did it was just straight up multiply them, bam, got 116. Second way I did it was I listed out all of the multiples and then chose the smallest one. There's another way to do it. This third way is using the factors. And so we did a lot of prime factorization yesterday. So here's what I really like about this method, you guys. Use the factors, use the force. Use the factors. Okay, so because you're using the factors, if the numbers are really weird and you really just can't figure out what the least common denominator is, a lot of times using the factors ends up being a little bit easier. So I have 8 and I have 20. 8, 20. My first step is to get the prime factors. So step 1, prime factor. 8 is 2 times 4. 4 is 2 times 2. 20 is 2 times 10. 10 is 2 times 5. Great. So the prime factors of 8 are 2 times 2 times 2. The factors of 20 are 2 times 2 times 5. Okay, so step 1, prime factors. Step 2, what do they have in common? Write numbers they have in common once. Should use a different color. Write the numbers they have in common just the one time. Great. So that's kind of the reason why I line them up like this, is it makes it easier for me to visualize. So see how they have this 2 in common? I'm going to write that once. The least common multiple will be, okay, so I'm going to write that one time. They have this 2 in common. I'm going to write that one time. Now these ones they don't have in common. This 20 doesn't have another 2 that I can circle. So these are my stragglers. They're my leftovers. My poor little leftovers, right? All right, so number 3, write the leftovers. Okay, so I've got a times 2 and I've got a times 5. This will 100% of the time be your LCM. So I don't need to list the multiples. And many times, let's face it, we forget the one multiple we need. I've done it. We've all done it. This, if you can do your prime factorization and then write them out, the ones they have in common get written once, then the stragglers. This is my least common denominator, my least common multiple. 2 times 2 is 4. Times 2 is 8. 8 times 5 is 40. That's it. 40. Now, with my fractions, I had 5/8 and 7/20. I now know that my LCM is 40. To make equivalent fractions, I'm going to multiply by a dressed up form of 1. 8 times 5 is 40. 5 times 5 is 25. 2 times 20 times 2 is 40. 7 times 2 is 14. So I've made my equivalent fractions using that least common multiple or common denominator. So those are the 3 ways that we are going to practice today in class on how to make the least common multiple. The first way is correct. Like there's nothing wrong with just straight up multiplying them. But when I get 100 over 160, and then you have to, maybe you have 3 numbers and the denominator just gets really kind of crazy. Or you can list all the multiples and find where they have in common, or you can use the factors. All 3 of these methods technically work. It kind of is just situational. All right, you guys, I will see you in a little bit for class.